and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for our program today, Complex Generics and the Prescription Drug Landscape, where we'll be exploring complex generic medical alternatives and their possible impacts on the American healthcare system. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Association for Accessible Medicine, for its support of today's event. According to some recent consumer surveys, nearly 60 million American adults have difficulty affording their prescription drug medicines, even with insurance. That's really a big deal, even with insurance, putting their health and financial priorities at odds. Generic alternatives of complex medicines have the potential to generate significant savings for both patients and the healthcare system. But market dynamics and regulatory complexities are seen as significant hurdles. What policies can be put into place to safely accelerate evaluation and approval timelines and development processes? Could legislation like next year's reauthorization of the generic drug user fee amendments create opportunities for policy changes? And what does all this mean for patients? Let's put patients right at the middle. We're going to try and do that through today's conversations. We're going to be putting these questions and more in front of our fantastic lineup of speakers. First, a couple of housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events, all one word, The Hill Events, using the hashtag TheHillRx. We're broadcasting live. We'll be taking your questions throughout the program. And please send me questions because I need help on this subject, and many of you are going to know more than I do, so we're going to have fun with this. As with any live stream, you could experience some trouble. They say refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. My first guest today is Dr. Sally Choi. She's the director of the FDA's Office of Generic Drugs within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Dr. Choi, welcome. So as I said, I admitted my humility in this arena, and we're looking to you as an expert. We're talking a little bit about complex generics, and I think the best place to start is to explain to our audience what some of the lines are between these different lines of drugs. What is a complex generic? How is it differentiated between other parts of the drug portfolio?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, the generic drugs are copies of a brand name medications with some allowable differences, such as having different colors or flavorings. Generic drugs can be considered in two large buckets of traditional and complex. And examples of more traditional non-complex generic drugs would be like immediate release medications such as ibuprofen tablets or statin tablets where we have a lot of experience in developing. The complex generic drugs, as the word complex indicates, these are the generic drugs that actually have complex active ingredients, complex dosage form formulations, complex routes of delivery, or complex drug device combination products. Some examples of complex drug products include topical creams, the ophthalmologic gels, auto-injectors, inhalers, extended release tablets, or abuse-deterrent opioid tablets.
Well, with that, I think in the process of looking at this question, and obviously, I think if patients want a drug or if an industry wants to move with the drug, obviously the focus they put on it is timing and when can things come in. And so there's a time element. But your job is to keep the public safe. So how does the process work in terms of assuring safety, but also bringing new products into the market?
Yes, definitely there are standard ways of assessing these generic products. And when the generic industry actually submits their application, there is a very specific goal date that is actually being set up. So that most of the original, the generic drug applications, when they're submitted, that we have a goal date of meeting the 10 months clock of approving or giving that action on those drug products.
Dr. Choi, we have a question actually we're taking. I'm just going to weave it in because it's a question I would ask. And I'm not sure it's the FDA's role, but Derek Gingery, the senior writer for the Pink Sheet, asked, how can the FDA spur interest in complex generics that currently have no competition? So it's an interesting question. So sometimes, you'll get a generic in the market, but it won't be widely shared. So do you have concerns? And is that an appropriate role for the FDA to say, hey, or is that beyond your purview, is actually to look at market competition?
Well, we do actually recognize challenges in this area, and we actually have done ways to promote the complex generic drug development. For example, last year in 2020, FDA awarded a grant to establish the Center for Research on Complex Generics to support the generic drug industry researchers and other stakeholders by offering collaborative research and training through webinars, workshops, laboratory projects and complex generic scholars program. So we're hoping this kind of cutting edge center will stimulate the innovative, the dialogue, and disseminate current understanding of complex products and practices, and generate new knowledge in support of complex generic drugs. And this type of a forum where we actually give workshops and speaking engagements, we're trying to promote the importance of the complex generic drug development.
It's fascinating. So I'm going to ask you an unfair question, but I'm enjoying this. I hope you are. You know, we're going to have a speaker on later who's talking about, the complex generic drugs that have been, made available in places like Canada or Europe. I guess my question to you as a scientist and also as a regulator is to what degree, and I don't know how to put this, how can we get the science table even? When you watch COVID and you watch vaccine development, there's a lot of exchange between governments and private sector and also internationally. Do we have that same standard between the sort of US FDA and what's going on in Europe? Because a lot of people raise the fact that in Europe they have certain drugs available that we don't have in the United States. So I guess as a scientist and regulator, do we need to put more infrastructure there, or is it the way it should be now?
Well, I believe the FDA actually is the number one world leader in this area. And maybe it might not be as visible to you, but they're actually having a lot of collaboration between the FDA and other regulatory agencies in other countries. And there's always that constant dialogue. There's ICH-related meetings, and there's just a lot of collaboration that goes on, even in terms of during these COVID-19 pandemic situations, in terms of even the inspections and in other areas, that there is definitely a good communication and collaboration going on. And therefore, definitely we're not operating in any isolation, and we're fully aware of other countries' efforts in what they are doing. And but I still believe that we actually are leading the world in terms of developing this complex generic drug in this area.
Sally, let me ask you another unfair question. That's a great answer. Let me ask you another unfair question. You, more than anyone else, sees the pipeline, because I think, all these pharmaceutical firms, generic firms, they're filing with you for approvals. You're going through. So you see much more than anyone else. In fact, I think that's pretty much a black box to many folks. I know that people go through processes. But let me just ask you a question. Do you feel that around the corner, both on generics, but also in other pharmaceutical devices and other pharmaceutical answers, is this going to be a robust couple of years ahead in terms of new products on the market? Or do you suspect that it's going to be pretty traditional and conventional? We're going to go follow rate? Because I get the sense that we're always on the edge of these real interesting technological revolutions. And I'm wondering if you're feeling that in your pipeline.
Well, actually, the advantage of being in the generic side, as I mentioned, this is a copy of the brand drugs, and therefore, based on the new drug approvals, we can kind of track and estimate when the generics actually might be available. Therefore, it's a lot more transparent and somewhat than maybe the new drug side. And looking at, and you asked about how do we feel about the next couple of years? Well, one indication that we see is that we get a lot of questions and inquiries from the generic industry about certain drug product developments, and they can submit those requests through so-called control correspondence. And we've been seeing an incredible number of increase in this control correspondence. What that tells us is that there is a high interest, there's an incredible amount of interest in the generic industry who want to develop the generics going forward. And therefore, I do believe that the pipeline in generic area is quite strong.
Dr. Choi, let me ask you one question. You deal with industry. Your role is not to be cozy with industry or to necessarily make industry work better, but you do have to work together. If you were to give a bit of advice to industry that's on the other side of this, what are some of the common things that you think would improve the drug and generic development process? What are some of the missing parts of the bridge, if you will, between successfully bringing these next generation products? What does industry and the public need to understand that it might not?
Generic drug industry actually has, I think, has advanced in many past several years, many actually years, and there are I think what they can do is they can take advantage more of all the programs that we actually offer. For example, for the complex generic drugs that we have implemented a pre-ANDA meeting. And this is a type of meeting that the generic industry can actually take advantage of requesting a meeting to talk about their complex generic drug development and the regulatory expectations. And these are available to them. And also the industry actually completing the quality application for us. That makes a lot of the time saving, the effort saving in terms of us making the action and the decision on these approvals. I have to say though, since especially the GDUFA, the user fee program, I think there has been a lot of improvements and advancement in communication, the quality of the application in the industry side, as well as transparency in our review process. And therefore, going forward, I think that this area is going to be even better and more collaborative than before.
Just real quick, Dr. Choi, because I'm about to talk to Dr. Alex Brill from the American Enterprise Institute, who's an expert on a lot of these issues. Is it your sense that bringing these complex generic drugs really does impact the bottom line cost to patients? Do you sense that the role you and the FDA are playing is leading there? Because we haven't had enough time in this talk to talk about the cost of drugs, cost of healthcare, and there are a lot of players in that world. We should admit. But I'm just interested. Do you think that you're having an impact on that? That complex generics are having an impact on the bottom line that patients feel?
Actually, I'm glad you asked that question because I do want to share some numbers with you.
Oh, great.
While FDA doesn't really control the drug pricing, our policies do affect the competition in the market. And we know that more generics on the market lead to more competition, which can drive prices down. There's some statistics that I have. If multiple generic drug companies market the same product, competition can result in about 85% price reduction from the brand name. And because of generic medicine, Americans actually saved $313 billion in health care costs in 2019. And also 90% of the prescription filled in the US during 2019 was dispensed as generics, but accounts for only 20% of all drug spending. And lastly, the 92% of the generic prescriptions were filled at less than $20. The average generic copay in 2019 was $6.97 compared to the average brand name copay, which was $56.32. To me, these numbers speak loud. And what that means is that we need to bring more generics, more complex generic products to the market for competition so that we can actually help the price going down.
Well, Dr. Sally Choi, I regret because I'm enjoying this and I've learned a lot more than I thought I could get into my head in this arena. But Dr. Sally Choi, Director of the Office of Generic Drugs at the FDA, really appreciate you giving us a little insight into the process and the impact on complex generic drugs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
As I just mentioned, Alex Brill is the founder and CEO of Matrix Global Advisors, and he's resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies and works on healthcare reform, pharmaceutical spending, and drug innovation, among other issues. And I should mention that he just had, I have it on yellow paper and not the really cool look. He's just issued today, as I understand it, a paper called Potential Savings from Accelerating U.S. Approval of Complex Generics. This is you, right? Same Alex Brill, right, Alex?
That's me.
Thank you. So I've just pretty much read the executive summary. But my understanding is I just mentioned you, and I mentioned Canada and Europe and said, hey, here are these other places where complex generics are available in these other places. You've gone through and looked at 7 specific complex generic drugs and looked at what the potential cost savings are in America. But rather than me telling that story, why don't you?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. That was a great interview with Dr. Choi. I think she shed a lot of light on her role and the importance of what a complex generic is and the importance of having more complex generics come to market in the United States. What the paper does, and I can get you a copy that's not printed on yellow paper. I can get you a copy on white paper if you'd like. What the paper does is it looks at 7 products that we were able to identify where either Canada, Canadian Health, or the Europeans, EMA, have approved a generic of a complex product, and that product is available in those markets. And these are not, these are the FDA's peer regulatory agencies, right? These are first world. As Dr. Choi said, the FDA may be number 1, but the Canadians and the Europeans are close behind. These are reputable regulatory agencies. They have found a way to work with the generic sponsors to approve those products, generics of those products, and those products have come to market in either Europe or Canada or both, and are generating savings there. So we said that those products seem reasonable to think that it'd be reasonable for the FDA to do the same, to approve those products here. A lot of policymakers have talked about the long approval process for complex products. We've seen members of Congress, we've seen former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb talk about this. We need to do better on this front. We need to accelerate these processes. And what the paper does is it asks the question, if those products were available in the United States today, generics of these products, how much savings might we expect? Is it $50, $500, $5 billion? What is it? The way we came to those numbers is we looked at the sales of the brand products in 2019. We made some assumptions about the types of competition, the degree of competitive dynamics we'd expect among these products, and ran a variety of assumptions through a model, and that yielded us a result. Our central estimate from that output is $1.3 billion in annual savings if those 7 products existed in the U.S. market today in their generic form. Could be a little bit higher, could be a little bit lower. Depends exactly how many generic manufacturers are able to get into that market. Depends on how much market share they're able to capture. So there's a range of estimates that we present in the paper, but our central estimate is $1.3 billion.
So Alex, let me I don't know how the question is going to come out, but I've dealt with questions related to the FDA, interviewed many FDA directors over generations of them. And I guess my best sense is that depending on what part of the FDA you want to come up, a lot of the code, the processes were developed decades ago. Not all the time, and they're certainly updated. So I don't want to create any false critiques of the FDA. But there are processes that they develop around the subject of keeping the public safe. And Europe and Canada may have different systems that have evolved. So I guess my question to you is: are there parts of that process of looking at complex generics, or looking at the interaction of devices with active ingredients, or the dosing process, or what are the nuts and bolts of the critique, if you will, that you think need to be changed, if anything, within the U.S. FDA?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say that I don't think we should think of this as a system that was created decades ago and that we're stuck in the same process. I mean, that's not what you're suggesting, but it's an evolving process. The FDA is constantly working with an applicant to bring an application through the review appropriately and efficiently as they can. And as Dr. Choi described, they call these products complex for a reason, right? And so each one of them is unique. The reason that they're complex may vary from product to product. It may be that it's a cream. It may be that it's associated with a device like an inhaler. So it's both the ingredient that's in the inhaler and the inhaler itself together that need to be replicated by the generic manufacturer, or a host of other reasons that make these products complex. So in many cases, it's really a case-by-case issue where the agency is saying to the applicant, we need you to prove to us, we need you to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of the product, and in this particular case, we need this particular information. And so because every one of them is a bit unique, it's hard to come up with a rigid set of rules that will govern the whole thing. But what we know is that the FDA is making progress, has made progress. And you mentioned the GDUFA. So we had GDUFA 1, now we're in GDUFA 2, we're getting ready for GDUFA 3. And what we saw in GDUFA 2 was a whole set of new processes, the intent of which is to accelerate the approval of complex generics. What we haven't seen from that is we haven't seen a whole bunch we haven't seen all of the, I shouldn't say I haven't seen any, but we haven't seen all of the complex generics finish their way through that pipeline. But we are seeing a lot more applicants and a lot more dialogue between the generic manufacturers and the FDA in an effort to get over that finish line and get to market.
Alex, I invited a lot of people today online to watch this, including on my own Facebook page, who may not know what GDUFA is. So I just want them to know it's the Generic Drug User Fee Amendment. So I just want to kind of put that out there, that Google it, you'll learn more. Let me ask you another question. I mean, because you're in this, you and I have talked before about this and a lot of regulatory issues. You sort of feel where gravity is taking you. Is gravity taking us in the right direction on complex generics, or do you think you have to tweak the way gravity works to get there? In other words, is the U.S. system going the right way, and so it will require minimal effort, with GDUFA, with others, or is this a big lift to try to, get the cost savings that you're talking about, to try to get, I don't know whether to call it greater efficiencies or greater trust in the data sharing, I guess, across certain national lines? Where do you feel this is going?
My sense is that all of the stakeholders are pulling in the same direction, the right direction, right? And so this is not an issue where on one side of the table, they want to slow things down, and on the other side of the table, they're begging to make efficiencies and improvements. This is an issue where we've heard from Janet Woodcock, we heard from former Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, we've heard from lawmakers, and we've heard from the industry, AAM and individual generic manufacturers, all saying, hey, let's figure out a way to bring more competition, not just necessarily one generic competitor. Let's figure out a way that anyone who's capable of making a generic version of a complex product can get through the approval process. Let's have an approval process. Of course, we need to have a thorough and robust approval process, but let's have it be clear, and let's have it be well-resourced, so that everyone can work together to accelerate that. I think that's one of the issues that they're going to be talking about when they reauthorize the legislation. And I think it's the specific solutions, I think, are going to be technical. They're not issues that are addressed in the paper. They're not problems that I've solved yet. But I think that at least everyone has the same goal, which is to figure out how to bring savings to the market sooner and more
Alex,
predictably.
Real quick, they're cutting me off here, but I'm going to be talking to Congressman Peter Welch, an old friend, and Congressman Brett Guthrie shortly, both of whom are very involved in this. What question do you think is most important that they answer?
You want me to do your job? Sure. So, so there's an absolute role for congressional oversight in this process. The GDUFA will come up for a vote. And they need to, they have the right and quite frankly, the obligation to ask, in their oversight capacity, to ask the FDA, why are things taking longer now? What are the impediments? And what can the FDA do in an efficient way to accelerate those processes? I know they're both interested in the answers to those questions. They've been in dialogue, I'm sure, with the FDA. And the more that we can bring that discussion to a larger audience, to this audience, I think the more all of us are going to learn.
Well, Alex Brill, Resident Fellow, American Enterprise Institute, I want to thank you because I always learn from you, and thanks for putting up with some of my humor too. So thanks so much for joining us today. Congratulations on the release of your report, which I do look forward to receiving, potential savings from accelerating U.S. approval of complex generics, which is out today from, I guess, Matrix Global Advisors, right? So
that's right.
Great. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay. Thanks for having me on, Steve.
And now for a message from our sponsor. Please welcome Christine Bader, Senior Vice President, Chief Operating Officer for U.S. Generics at Teva, in conversation with Christine Simmons, Senior Vice President of Policy and Strategic Alliances at the Association for Accessible Medicines. And thank you for your support of this program today.
Hello and welcome all. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Christine Simmons. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy and Strategic Alliances at the Association for Accessible Medicines, and I'm also the Executive Director of their Biosimilars Council. AAM is the nation's leading trade association for the makers of generic and biosimilar medicines. And I'm very excited to have you all here virtually with us to learn about complex generics and the very timely subject of the Generic Drug User Fee Amendments, also known as GDUFA. And I want to especially thank Teva, who supported this program today through an educational grant, which has enabled AAM to host today's session on this important topic. So to put the scope and impact of this topic to patients in the healthcare system in context, in the United States, generic medicines are 90% of all prescriptions dispensed, but account for only 20% of total drug cost. Joining me on the virtual stage is Christine Bader, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for U.S. Generics at Teva Pharmaceuticals. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So let's begin with the basics. What are complex generics? And also, I'm curious about the urgency of this issue, given that there are various competing health policy priorities before the new administration and the Congress. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, and also enhancing the Affordable Care Act and other issues. So can you talk a bit about why stakeholders should be thinking about complex generics now?
Sure. So first of all, complex generics, similar to other generic medications, cross all kinds of therapeutic lines, treat things from schizophrenia, multiple sclerosis, cancers, and diabetes. But something about them is more complex than traditional medications. That can range from the API to the dosage form, and oftentimes it has to do with the drug device or the delivery system. Some products that you may know that we would consider complex are epinephrine autoinjector and inhalers such as generic Advair. What I would say about the urgency is that complex generics are an untapped opportunity to bring additional savings to the system. Alex Brill's study shows that just 7 of these complex generics that are already available in Canada or Europe could bring savings of an estimate of $1.3 billion per year to the American system. So if we're going to continue to get the savings associated with generic medications, we're going to have to figure out how we more efficiently get approvals for complex generic drugs.
That background and context is very helpful. Well, let's go ahead and dive into GDUFA a little bit more. I know many in our audience are more familiar with PDUFA, which pertains to user fees for brand drugs. Can you give us the background on GDUFA, the generic drug user fee amendments?
Sure, happy to do that. But before we do that, I do just want to say that we should be super proud of the efforts that we have made between legislatures, regulators, policymakers, and manufacturers to have the success with generic drugs that we have had. It's a collaborative effort, as we all know, and 90% of prescriptions is a big number. $300 billion per year in savings is something we should all be extraordinarily proud of. The good news is in 2012, GDUFA was passed in an effort to speed the efficiency of approval for generic drugs. And that would therefore stimulate competition and ultimately bring savings to the healthcare system and, most importantly, patients. We have an opportunity now with our 3rd round of GDUFA that it is up for renewal every 5 years. And so we will be having a new GDUFA in 2022. We have an opportunity to tweak those things that maybe weren't necessarily contemplated fully in 2012, because again, we had very different drugs in the generic application cycle. Now that we have more complex drugs, there are new needs and new systems and infrastructure that needs to be built to support those approvals. And the amazing thing to me about GDUFA is that we're all very much naturally aligned. Right? Everyone in the entire system is excited to be able to create better access and lower cost. So when we have alignment of intention, we should be able to come up with a structure and an infrastructure that supports the efficiency of approvals, and then we all win.
Well, that's great. So, Christine, you mentioned that approvals for complex generics have been stagnant in recent years. How long does it generally take to get a complex generic approved by the FDA? And can you talk about the impact of that time frame on patients and on the industry?
Sure. I mean, the unfortunate consequence is every month that you have a generic that is not approved, you don't have lower cost access for patients. That then drives up the overall cost to the healthcare system. It's a complication for payers. So what I would say is the last statistic that I've seen is that it takes over 44 months on average to go from application to approval. And on complex generics, we're seeing timelines sometimes that are even longer.
So on that note, what changes are Teva and other industry stakeholders looking for?
So again, the good news is that I think that all the stakeholders are very aligned in what we're looking for, which is to get affordable medications to patients as quickly as possible. And there are three things that we think would really aid in that. One is increased transparency. If there is an issue, if there is something that they can tell us as an agency, please tell us. The second would be predictability. Understanding timelines and expectations are essential to ensuring that as a manufacturer, we take steps to be ready to support generic launch. And the third thing would be better guidance practices overall, whether that's discussion of product-specific guidances or CRLs.
So, Christine, you just mentioned increased predictability, better guidance practices, and more transparency. Let's pause on these and ask you to just go into it a little bit more. What would improvements in these areas mean for manufacturers? And what about patients? How are these issues impacting patients?
I mean, the second half of your question is really the most important, right? Which is, what do we do to get lower cost alternatives available to patients? And any delay in the approval, any inefficiency in the approval process slows down that shared goal that we have. So these mechanisms that we just discussed, including better guidance practices, are a vehicle in which we can remove inefficiency and work together collectively to ultimately get more affordable medications to the market and create better access.
Thanks so much for breaking that down. Now, I know that we have covered a lot quickly here, and I want to be sure that everyone has your key takeaways top of mind as we conclude. So can you please give us a quick recap? What are 3 key takeaways you want the audience to have from our discussion today?
First, the policy matters are urgent. With the global pandemic and the economic crisis that we are all anticipating in this country, it is essential that we get affordable medications to the market as quickly as possible. The second is that generics are a vehicle for success and something as Americans we should all be very proud of. Generics save an average of $300 billion per year, and 90% of the medication that people take is generic. Complex generics, a recent study by Alex Brill, suggests they could save another $1.3 billion per year for just 7. So think of the infinite possibility of the amount of money that we could potentially find to fund other areas of our healthcare system, which is exciting. And the third thing is that the time is now. We're negotiating GDUFA, which is a great vehicle to align policy and structure to ensure that all the stakeholders that are very committed to affordable medication and are aligned can speak the same language and work together to accomplish a shared goal.
Super, that's great, Christine. Thank you so much. And thank you for all that you and Teva do for America's patients.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you today.
Thank you. Thank you to Christine and Christine. That was great. My next guest is Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont. Congressman Welch sits on the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. He's also a co-chair and founder of the Affordable Medicines Caucus. A long time back. He's been on this for a great while. Congressman Peter, it's been a while since we've talked, but one of the things I try and do when we have these discussions about what could become a wonky subject is remind people why these things matter. And I'll never forget when I was on stage with you and you told me the story of your first wife who passed and why you are so committed to changing the cost of the healthcare. And I don't want to tell your story. Can you tell us a bit about Joan and why this subject matters so much?
Well, for medications do wonderful things. They alleviate pain and they extend life. And of course, the vaccines with COVID are just a vivid example of how profoundly important they are to the well-being of our citizens. And my wife had cancer. She struggled with that for 9 years. And her quality of life was extended significantly as a result of medications. The downside is that the cost of medications is killing us. So if you have a good thing, and we have wonderful medical care in this country, but if it is so expensive, including the cost of prescription drugs in particular, that you can't afford it, then obviously it's not going to do us any good. So this issue of making certain that we can get the best that medical science can offer through drugs, and that we can get prices that our the citizens and our government can afford, and our employers, that's really essential. In the two Christines, I was able to listen to them. And Steve, I don't know why you're wasting your time on me. They did a great job. I mean, the bottom line on generics, we're talking about making things a lot more affordable. 90% of the drugs, the prescriptions are generics, and 20% of the revenue is generics. I mean, that kind of tells you right there. But it didn't happen by accident. I mean, the pharma companies, the name brand pharma companies, they're really good at two things. One is, with the help, by the way, of taxpayers, the NIH, the CDC, they're good at creating medications that really help people. That's a very good thing. They're also good at their pricing power. And one of the ways that they've been really good for themselves at their pricing power is elbowing out generic competition. And we got to start in addressing that with the CREATES Act last year. And of course, that was a bipartisan bill that I was the sponsor of. And it essentially is trying to unwind some of these obstacles that the brand name drugs put in the path of the generics, because the brand name drugs that already benefit by legislated monopoly periods with the patent, they want to extend that beyond the life of the patent. So the steps we have to take are to allow for transparency, allow for ending the delays in the two Christines we're talking about, GDUFA, and that, I think, is something that's very, very important for us to pass.
Congressman, as I had Dr. Sally Choi of the FDA in there, who is responsible for the world of generics, had a fascinating deep dive discussion on, their role and how they see the market and how they work with industry, et cetera. But from your perspective, what are the roadblocks as you see it in the complex generic world? What do you think needs to be sped up or gotten out of the way or invested in? What is the dimension that you think needs to be fixed still?
Well, really, there's three points of friction. Okay, number one, the generic industry is doing all it can to come up with the generic alternatives, including complex, and that's on them. And they're doing a pretty good job on it. Secondly, is the governmental process, where you really do have to really minimize barriers. And what one of the Christines mentioned is really true. How do you have a government that is going to be very clear on the policy, that's going to be transparent, that's going to give clear guidelines and predictability, so that when the generic manufacturers are going through the approval process, it's a roadmap and not an obstacle course. So I think that's where GDUFA comes in. And then third, there's got to be a crackdown on anti-competitive practices where the brand name drugs are really doing every single thing they can to block the introduction of generics. And that's where the CREATES Act was a step in the right direction. So those are the things that we need to do. Bottom line, if you can get that life-saving, pain-relieving, life-improving medication, and you're a consumer, and you're an employer who wants to take care of your employees through employer-sponsored health care, or you're in the Medicaid or Medicare program, you want to get it for less, not more. And that's what this whole objective is to have competition and the benefit of the lower prices that come with our generic drug industry.
Let me ask you an unfair question, Peter. The administration, has changed. We're in a political inflection point in the country. I know that President Trump talked a lot about getting drug prices down, about promoting generics as well. Is there any change or shift that's important in the political winds that helps or hurts, or did you find both the Biden and the Trump administration largely on the same course?
President Trump was good on that, at least rhetorically. He couldn't get it to go anywhere, but he had an idea. I met with him early on in his administration, along with Elijah Cummings. And of course, the two of us were the sponsors of the Prescription Drug Price Negotiation Act. And when you're talking to we were in the Oval Office with President Trump, I thought we were in talking to Bernie Sanders when it came to prescription drugs, because all of the above, importing from Canada, reference pricing, price negotiation, all of those things were things that he really advocated. But was unable to get those done. We did pass price negotiation in the House last year, and of course it didn't go anywhere in the Senate. But the bottom line is that this is a really affordability of healthcare, and prescription drugs in particular, is really a central issue. And many of my Republican colleagues, you're going to have Brett Guthrie, he's a wonderful leader in Congress, on after. All of us have constituents that just can't afford it. And we have employers who would love to give a bigger raise to their employees, but when the premiums on their employer-sponsored healthcare rocket up, it really cuts down on the ability to give that raise. So there's been wage stagnation that in significant part is a result of healthcare escalation in prices. So this effort to get the prices down is going to be good for folks that Brett Guthrie represents, and it's going to be good for folks that I represent. And it's a potential unifying issue for us in Congress in these troubled times.
Last question, Congressman. Generic drug user-free amendments, otherwise known as GDUFA for my audience out there. What can be tweaked? What can be improved? What do you think ought to be on our dashboard? What we can do better in terms of the reauthorization as we get into next year?
Well, the generic industry is pretty good. They're not shy. They know where to find all of us, and they do it often. So I'm not sure you have to change all that much. I frankly think that we've got to keep making the case. And as Christine pointed out, if we can get more savings, what's wrong with that, right? And we have the same or better health outcomes. So just keep the drumbeat there, because I think this question of bringing down the cost of healthcare, and as you know, Steve, the cost of prescription drugs is the fastest rising component in healthcare. That is really essential to make healthcare accessible. And it's also important because it's a way that we're going to be able to start lifting people's wages.
Let me squeeze one last one in. I'm going to make my people crazy, but David Baran is a senior director of National Federal Accounts for Gilead, asked, given relations with some of America's international trading partners and from a national security perspective, he asked, will generic companies be required to source and manufacture products within the continental U.S.? I think it's a very interesting question, because what we've gone through with COVID and some of the kind of heart seizures that we had over what we were dependent on in the global supply chain has focused the spotlight on what is manufactured here, or what is manufactured, with where trusted allies are. But in this world, are you thinking at all at about supply chain issues with regards to drug inventory?
Not that way. As you know, the president is using the Defense Production Act, and President Trump used the Defense Production Act to address our shortage of PPE. But that hasn't been an issue that I've heard discussed with respect to the supply chain when it comes to drugs. I mean, the big issue for us on drugs is affordability and accessibility. So that's not an issue where I've heard discussion among my colleagues on either side of the aisle about making that requirement.
Well, Congressman Peter Welch from Vermont, it's great to talk to you as always. Thank you for bringing so much wisdom and thought. You've done so much in this issue. I'm never tired of talking to you, so thanks for always saying yes.
It's good to see you, Steve. Bye-bye.
Thank you. And now it's time for our panel of experts. Tammy Boyd is Chief Policy Officer and Counsel for the Black Women's Health Imperative. She worked on healthcare issues during her time as Legislative Director in the office of late Congressman John Lewis. That's a big name, and great to have her with us today. Dr. Kasha Patel is the CEO of Carolina Blood and Cancer Care and a full-time practicing medical oncologist. He's also the president of the Community Oncology Alliance and chairs its Biosimilars Committee. And Tanya Winders, is it Winders? Winders, Tanya Winders. Tanya, am I getting it right? Winders, I don't know if they hear us, is President and CEO of the Asthma and Allergy Network. She's also chair of the American Respiratory Care Foundation and president of the Global Allergy and Airways Patient Platform. Thank you all so much for joining us. So we have an audience problem. I don't know, can anyone hear me? Okay, we're working on that for a second. Well, we're going to talk to them all in just a moment about the variety of issues that sort of sit around this area. And these are interest groups and whatnot, from allergy and asthma, Black women's health, those that are vulnerable communities and marginalized communities. Do we have them now? Is everybody with me?
Can you hear him?
You were all just beautifully introduced. I'm Steve Clemens. Oh, you don't hear me
No,
yet.
we can't, no.
Okay, we got to work on this, folks. Maybe we take a little break here. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. Now can you hear me?
And yes.
Okay, great. Well, I just did a beautiful job introducing the three of you, I think, and it's great and an honor to be with all of you to discuss, this world of generics and various communities. Let me just start with Tammy and the Black Women's Health Imperative. And Tammy, I just said, what a giant you worked with in John Lewis, and so I'm inclined to sort of start there and ask, if John Lewis were with us today, such a major force, looking at basically inequality and the question of justice in our healthcare world. So as you think about the generics world and you think about our challenge in getting an equitable and just healthcare, platform out there, environment, what are the pieces that are most important to you?
Yes. So one of the most important issues is access for patients, access to life-saving therapies across all therapeutic areas. And I think, with the current environment with COVID, it's really shed a bright light on many of the inequities around disparities. As we know, many of us in healthcare already knew that these disparities were there. But I think we do have an opportunity in the current environment to begin to address those. And one is making sure that we provide access to life-saving drugs, complex generic drugs.
Well, thank you for that. What are some of the barriers there? Is it cost, or are there other systemic parts of this that are not in place, you think?
Yeah, so cost affordability is definitely one, but then generally speaking, not to just even look at that aspect, there's the social determinants of healthcare. And so as we begin to even look at ways and solutions, we have to take into account, do these patients have access to transportation? Do they have access, for example, for diabetes? African Americans are disproportionately impacted by type 2 diabetes. Black women specifically are 2 to 3 more times likely to have the disease. And so do they have access to, healthy food in their area? I know there's studies in Washington, D.C., Ward 7 and 8, the amount of grocery stores there are in the area. There's a lack of grocery stores in that area. And so really providing solutions that really will get to sort of the systemic issues of why there are those disparities.
Thank you. Dr. Patel, I know that you are also placed this question of how we get greater equality in healthcare provision and why we're not doing it. I want to give you an opportunity to say, as we're talking about this complex dimension, we're going to get Tanya in this in a moment, kind of looking at allergy and asthma. And when you kind of look, everybody comes packaged with a certain set of issues that we need to deal with, that need to be part of this. But what I'm fascinated by your work is you're saying that we're systemically marginalizing communities. We've been doing it for a long time. We have to fix that. What are the parts of this picture that you think we need to move?
Well, I think I'm glad. I first feel honored that you considered me to be the part of the team. And off the line, I was talking to Tammy as well. As an oncologist with a practice in rural South Carolina, I see the massive disparity with access to care, access to testing. And what Tammy brought up, the issue about the diabetes, there's a whole new global project called Genome-Wide Association Studies. They track the genomic analysis of different population funded by the federal governments across the world. And in the last release of the study in 2017, out of 35 million samples analyzed, 80% plus belong to the Northern European ancestry, probably about 2% to the African American ancestry. Now, this is a global, so if you look into the Northern European ancestry population makes less than 10%. So 80% plus resources are dedicated to studying the evolution of disease using genomics that includes cancer, diabetes, hypertension, drug addiction. So there's a massive global challenge. And even after President Biden Obama in 2015 announced the Precision Medicine Initiative, we are far from achieving that. And the problem is, if we do not understand the complex factors of what we call environmental epigenetics, how chronic stress, how chronic discrimination leads to genomic changes that perpetuate below the generation. So we are not only exposing the generation to less privileged status, but we are also perpetuating by giving it to the future generations, which results in obesity, hypertension, diabetes, and cancer. So we have to make a global systemic approach to understand the impact of the environmental factors, social determinants of health onto the genetics, which then get passed on to the future. But the second implication is when you develop the drug, for example, drug A may work very well in a group of people, but drug B may not work as well in the same group of patients. So we can't generalize that hypertension drug will work same in Caucasian, Asian, Indian, or African American. So this is a systematic issue. And as incoming co-op president, as well as somebody has a leadership role at different level, I've taken the Precision Medicine Initiative and the disparity at the top of my priority list.
Well, thank you. Real quick before I jump to Tanya, and just very fast answer, if you would mind, Dr. Patel. You know, as you talk about different drugs, different communities, one of the questions that came up with Dr. Sally Choi is whether or not we need to have more data sharing, more data acceptance and trust, if you will, across national lines. You know, there's been some discussion of why Europe and Canada have certain complex generics available to their patients, but they're not available in the U.S. Do you think there's a breakdown there, or do you think it's sort of, you know, about right?
No, it's actually, there are so many silos here. Everyone wants to preserve their kind of data identity. And that actually, again, perpetuates the problem that we face. And I want to add one more topic about complex generics, because, you know, people think that, oh, how about it? $100 saving may not be huge, but to my patient living in Chester, South Carolina, whose truck frequently breaks up on way to my clinic, $100 saving may make 7% of his monthly income. So we just can't look at the amount of saving. No, people discount it. Oh, $100 may not make a difference. Yes, it may not make a difference to this audience, but to someone who's most underprivileged, it matters most. And Mahatma Gandhi had once said that you judge the civil society by looking at how they treat their most vulnerable population, and not how they treat their wealthiest person.
Well, thank you. Tanya, you represent vulnerable populations, those people with allergies, with asthma. You've been round the circuit before in case of running into a provision of a you know, the EpiPen story is well known to folks, the drug involved there. I guess my question to you as we discuss what needs to be shifted in the generics landscape that can be shifted, you know, as a patient advocate, what is the voice we should be hearing in this?
Right. Well, none of us have to remember too far back to think about the EpiPen situation that you spoke of. So 2018, again, a basic monopoly in the market with that branded product. What most people don't know is that it had been a 10-year process of trying to get a generic approved, and through the process to actually have a generic in the market. And so what ended up happening, of course, was a 600% price increase that was oftentimes passed on to patients and those most vulnerable, as we've already heard. And so patients were going without this life-saving medication and taking chances every single time they ate as a result. And so what are some of the changes that we as a patient advocacy organization are recommending? First and foremost, we have to increase first cycle approvals. Currently, it's only 12% of applications that are approved in that first cycle. And in fact, most it takes 3 reviews or more. And each of those review cycles is upwards of 10 months. And so that's far too long. In the case of Advair, again, a very prominent treatment in our space of allergy and asthma, the 10-month delay that it took to get the first generic to market in that space cost patients and our system over $1 billion just in that 10-month delay. So these are the kind of examples in our space of allergy and asthma that indicate we must do something to change the process and to ensure greater transparency and communication in the process to get those first cycle approvals more readily acknowledged and adopted.
Right.
I also think we have to adopt some better guidance principles. And so that, of course, can often be an impediment to getting those cost-effective complex generics in the hands of patients.
Tanya, before I jump back to Tammy for a second, as you talk about first cycle approvals, just to play devil's advocate, I know you're advocating, but I guess the question that any normal person I think out there would ask is, are you sacrificing health and security at all? I mean, what are the, I had Sally Choi in there. I said, hey, is it, the process, working, your job is to produce, protect the public. So are there, I'm asking the advocate this, but are there dimensions of vulnerability from increasing those up that ought to also be on our radar screen?
Well, I think we absolutely cannot forego safety and efficacy, right? I mean, that is a given. But what I think that is more of concern are these PSGs and the updates to those PSGs that really are not as relevant, that do not impact safety and efficacy, but continue, if you will, to shift the target so that those complex generic manufacturers don't exactly know what they're trying to achieve in order to get through the regulatory process more readily. And I think this creates a lot of confusion, but also creates significant economic burden on those generic manufacturers that is unnecessary.
I really appreciate that. Tammy, I want to come to you. We're short on time. This is a great conversation, but I'm now reading your tweets, the Black Women's Health. I recommend everyone come look and educate yourself. Fascinating things that you're tweeting out there, one of which is just staggering. You write, know the facts. February is Heart Health Month. Basically, 1 in 2 Black women over the age of 20 have some form of heart disease. Unbelievable. To me, it's unbelievable. I think that's, very important to be aware of and know. Another one you write, only 10% of rare diseases have an FDA-approved treatment. Where therapies do exist, they can be prohibitively expensive for many families. There's a third dimension I've done programs on, which is Black maternal mortality. I guess the question, that I look at when I ask this, we're talking about complex generics, but the broad healthcare system, when we're looking at, what Dr. Patel has called as marginalized communities or vulnerable communities or communities where there have been a history of chronic diseases for a variety of reasons. You worked for John Lewis. What do we have to do to level the field in a real way? I just want to give you the power. If you would change a few things, wake some people up, what would you put on the table?
Yeah, definitely. And to that point, in the spirit of John Lewis, one of the things that, working for him as his legislative director was, the power of coalition building. And so really I've extrapolated that from, working with Congressman Lewis and at the Black Women's Health Imperative. We've developed, for example, a rare disease diversity coalition where we have the American Medical Association, the Black Doctors, which is the National Medical Association, the Hispanic physicians, the Native American physicians, as well as other stakeholder groups, and as well as the industry to really come up with formal solutions to addressing some of these real issues. For example, why is there a delay in diagnosis for minorities with rare diseases? We are also created a sickle cell diversity coalition. And we're, definitely, you mentioned maternal mortality. We're definitely at the forefront and working with Congresswoman Underwood and Congresswoman Adams and Senator Cory Booker on really addressing the Black maternal crisis. And so, similar, it's about access. In terms of complex generics, we've attended several of the stakeholder meetings, making sure that we continue to advocate and really look through an equity lens. I think that's what's important too, is that, with President Biden, he recently signed several executive orders around equity. So really bringing an equity lens to the conversation, I think is very key as we go forward.
Thank you for that. Dr. Patel, one quick last word, if we can. I was very taken with what you just talked about diminishing the cost of, X product and what an incredible impact that would make on the life of one of your patients in rural Carolinas. I guess my question is to you, what tools do you most need? Whether it's more generics, what are the elements that you think, speaking for your patients, that we should hear and understand? Because I think that these human stories matter a lot, but just in real brief form, what should our viewers and listeners hear about making healthcare fairer, more affordable, and getting the picture right?
So at the micro level, at the perspective level, I think affordable access to cancer care is a fundamental equal right, not the privilege. I think we fail as a nation if we don't do that. And at a macro level, I think we have to have a coalition, and I'm in the process of building a coalition called Precision Medicine Alliance for Minorities in South Carolina, because we have a lot of underserved population. So I've taken the broad and very bold initiative of building it up and recognize the problem, find out the solution, and disseminate the information. These are the three. I always stick to the facts and not to the opinions.
Well, listen, I want to thank all of you. Fascinating conversation. Dr. Kashyap Patel, CEO of the Carolina Blood and Cancer Center. Tanya Winders, President and CEO of the Allergy and Asthma Network. And Tammy Boyd, Chief Policy Officer and Counsel of the Black Women's Health Imperative. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope you'll come back, because I want to continue this conversation in further iterations. I'm sure we're going to come back to this discussion again. Thank you.
So I definitely want to send information. I want to come back because I'm touched and moved by disparities across the country, and because large number of my patients are underserved, I really want to take this as a national issue.
Great panel. I'll say all three of you are doing that. Thank you, Tanya and Tammy as well.
Yeah.
My final guest is Congressman Brett Guthrie. Congressman Guthrie is the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. Congressman Guthrie, great to see you. Peter Welch had some very nice things to say about you and your work, I should just say. It's always nice to hear, basically some bipartisan compliments going. I was asking Peter a minute ago about whether there had been a real shift between the Trump administration and the Biden administration in this area of trying to get drug costs down. And he said, no, President Trump was quite good on this subject. He said he said the right things, he just had a hard time getting some of it going. In terms of getting it going, in terms of addressing, particularly complex generics, but the healthcare picture of getting it to work better, of getting, more drugs out into the marketplace to patients, what are the parts of it you think we should be focusing on?
Well, thanks a lot. And Peter is a good friend of mine. He's a great guy to work with. And, example of he and I working together on these issues show that we can do these bipartisan. When I say a great friend, one day I saw him walking through the Capitol with a whole box of Vermont maple syrup. And I said, what are those for? And he goes, I bring these to my friends every year. So hopefully this year, since he said nice things, I'll get a bottle of that as well. So the things to do it together, I think that the biggest thing that's going to be moving forward is all of the user fees. So when we do GDUFA this year, we have the opportunity to really address this. And if you look at Hatch-Waxman, it was really designed for simple generics. Essentially a generic process that you make the same. I've been in facilities, not necessarily pharmaceutical, where you would be surprised in some of the facilities you go to where you buy a brand name that costs more and a generic, and it's just simply a different label that moves down the pike. Not necessarily in pharmaceuticals, but similar to that. Where these are just complex and deliver different. And so what we have to do is go through this, hopefully have hearings with Chair Eshoo, and move forward that GDUFA really be our vehicle to make changes in this. We sent a bipartisan letter to Chair Pallone, was the main author of the letter, to then Dr. Hahn. And Dr. Hahn said there may be statutory requirements available that we need change, and he didn't really identify them. But that's what the hearing process is for, and then we all work together to do this. And as you said, Peter and I have talked about this quite a bit. It really was an issue with President Trump. Unfortunately, we didn't get too far with it. But every time I would see Secretary Azar, I would talk about we need to deal with drug pricing, and he goes, you and the president, every time I see him, ask me, we need to deal with drug pricing. And just because of everything moving forward, and of course, the last year, the entire Health and Human Services and CDC and FDA being involved in the pandemic as they should be, we didn't really get to address these. But as hopefully we'll be on the other side of the pandemic as the vaccine is out, and GDUFA is the absolutely proper place for us to take actions on these issues.
Congressman, is there anything the FDA isn't doing that it should be doing?
Well, I think you talked with Tanya before. As I said, the process is really where, if you look at the vision of generics when they put Hatch-Waxman was, it's essentially the same chemical. It can be, it goes in the body the same way. You look at the blood the same way. Some of these are really complex. They're different. So what the FDA, and we actually bipartisanly did this in the user fees last time. We had the pre-ANDA meetings, so the issue is, and I think Tanya talked about, 2 or 3 different cycles to get these approved. Right. The more information the manufacturer has going in, the better off they're going to be, because then they know what to present, what the FDA is looking for. So I think it's communication, and I think they really improved it, but there's always opportunities to continue to improve. And I think the FDA has proven to itself, it's certainly proven to the world, that when focused on an issue, they can get big things done. And just look at what they've done over the last year. And so hopefully we can take some of this momentum and as we talked with, I heard you talk with Tanya Winters just earlier, yeah. There can be no sacrifice in safety and efficacy, but we certainly can make things happen in terms of efficiency and speed.
Congressman, I used to work for a senator in the Senate, and Jeff Bingaman, and when he was asked me, so, Senator, years ago you wrote a letter to somebody, and I just always felt that was unfair. But I'm going to be unfair to you and ask you about a letter you wrote in February 2020, and you wrote a letter to the FDA, and you were interested in some information on some recent approvals in generics, and you were asking, as I understand it, how they're meeting requests for complex generics. So I don't know if you remember this letter, but if you do, can you share with us what the FDA shared with you about their process, and what gave you heart in some of this, and what concerned you?
Well, with the FDA, what they responded back is they really want to make this happen. So I'm just trying to think of specifics of that letter, but I did read a response back. I believe the FDA really wants to make generic competition better. And so if you look at the history of the FDA, and I haven't been involved in them as long as some others, so maybe they've done this before, but it's about safety and efficacy. That's their mission. And so if it takes 10 years to get an EpiPen on the marketplace to make sure it's safe and effective, then that's kind of their pathway. But if you look, the essence that I wanted to get at is it became the Drug Competition Action Plan, is that there is a role for the FDA to say, okay, let's see if we can be just as safe and just as effective, but also focus on the fact we need to get these to the marketplace as well. And I think that was the attitude, as Peter Welch said, that the previous president had. I think it's going to hopefully transfer into the current administration and the current HHS, that we can, that the FDA will say, we have responsibility for safety and efficacy. That's our mission. But we also have a responsibility to make sure that we aren't a roadblock to getting things to the marketplace. And I think that letter very openly, as I said a couple of things. If you look at the drug action plans, the FDA says we actually make a list of generics that don't have, of brand names that don't have generic equivalents, and therefore try to focus on those. So we, instead of getting more generics into the competition, because it may be easier to do, get more generics into approval because it adds to competition. And EpiPen is the best example of that whatsoever. The fact that it took 10 years, I don't know exactly why it took 10 years, but it doesn't seem like it should have taken that long. If it took that long because it had to be safe and effective, then that's proper. But my guess is we could have done that quicker.
Congressman, you're just such a cool wonk on these topics. I know we could talk about them all day, and I can tell you're really into the little narrow cubby holes and corners. But to that point, I think one of the interesting questions about the EpiPen story, I remember reporting on this story at the time, is one of the things I learned, it's uncomfortable for people to hear this, is it wasn't just, Mylan in this case. There were other issues involved, the insurance companies, deductibles, pharmacy benefit. There were a lot of players in what goes into the price of a drug and the sensitivity of that in the pocket. I guess my question to you, and just meant very innocently, as we're trying to get the costs of drugs down, and one part of it is the generic industry, are there other parts of it that need to be wrestled down as well?
Oh, you're absolutely correct on that. And it was interesting, Chair DeGette and I was the O&I for Energy and Commerce ranking member last time, and we sat down and said, we really want to look at the overall cost of pharmaceuticals. And we chose insulin because almost every family is impacted by it. There's not any huge legacy research costs that has to be recovered, but insulin prices were rising. So we said, and we had a couple of hearings about the whole process, from the manufacturer to it got to the retail to it got to the customer. And we really were making, I think, some headway. And I think we can do these things these 2 years. And we can deal with the whole supply chain. We can deal with complex generics through the approval process. We can deal with like Medicare Part D reform and out-of-pocket responses. But what happened as we had some really good policies that we were beginning to formulate, then that became HR 3, which was an all-encompassing pharmaceutical reform bill. Some of us would say it was price controls in pharmaceuticals. I think what hurt the robust pharmaceutical industry we have. We need to make sure they're not excess profits and they're affordable, but we also want to make sure we have a robust pharmaceutical industry. Look what they've done over the last year. And so the question we'll get, are we going to have, and the majority gets to determine this, are we going to have one massive pharmaceutical reform bill that has little chance of passing the Senate and probably not being signed into law? Or are things we can focus on like a laser beam and make big changes? You reform the insulin price, it has a big impact on government. It also on the budget. It also has a huge impact on people's lives, which is important. Medicare Part D and these complex generics. So think if we had a focused process that got the types of like EpiPen into approval quicker, how much difference that makes in people's lives. And so I understand I was just listening to something earlier on baseball. It seems like they're trying to soften the baseball because everybody swings for the fence now in Major League, and understand why you want to score a touchdown on every play. But sometimes you get a lot of first downs, you get a lot of base hits, you make a big difference in people's lives.
I'm always paralyzed when my friends talk about American sports because the only sport I know anything about is sumo. I was raised in Japan, basically. But
I don't know anything about sumo, so that might be a good metaphor.
I can talk about Yokozuna and all of that. But I just finally ask in this question, I asked the sort of same question of both Peter Welch and also Sally Choi from the FDA, which is, where do you think gravity is taking us? Do you think GDUFA is it, I always ask the question is, if we're here in 2 years, did we largely get what we need to do? And were we largely moving in the right direction? Is the pipeline robust enough that it will make an impact on America and people's lives? Or do we have to is there a big lift out there? Is that GDUFA? So I could ask you the question, do you feel like gravity needs to be shifted a bit to get into the right place? And if so, what are those things? Is it GDUFA or is there more?
Well, I think GDUFA for complex generics. I think GDUFA is a vehicle moving forward, because a lot of times Congress, a lot of people say it's the best place in the world to get nothing. If you want nothing done, go to Congress sometimes.
Right.
But we have things that we absolutely have to pass, and we have to on time pass GDUFA, and so we know there's a vehicle leaving the station, a bus leaving the station, or train, whatever you want to just call it.
Right.
And so there's opportunities if we do our homework, and beginning back with our February letter, the responses from Dr. Hahn, looking at the new FDA program, we can really make changes. We get, a crack at every few years. And this is our opportunity in our time to make sure that we have in place and try to go through what is getting in the way statutorily for FDA and the pharmaceutical companies to bring competition to the marketplace. Because the way we're going to solve drug prices, in my opinion, without totally dismantling the pharmaceutical industry that we don't want to do, is let people compete. If somebody's charging excess money for a pharmaceutical, government can react to it, or government can bring other players into the marketplace. And I think that's the best solution, because it brings better products and is more robust and at a better price.
Well, thank you, Congressman Brett Guthrie, ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health. Thank you so much for joining. We can do this a lot of other times, too, so I hope you'll come back.
I would love to do it, absolutely. As we progress in this, we definitely should do this.
Thank you. Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. A big thank you to AAM for its support, and all of you attendees for joining us for this discussion. For those of you who've missed any of the conversations, we will have a video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Be well.